talk to us a little bit about the situation that we're seeing in Kiev and the escalation that we're seeing in terms of violence.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is now a crisis of nearly 3 months standing, and it's a crisis precipitated when President Yanukovych decided not to conclude a trade deal with the EU. But it's a crisis which drew great strength when Mr. Yanukovych decided to use force to clear the streets in late November. He failed then, and he's trying again tonight.
So where do we go from here? I mean, you've had experience in this region for some time. Is there anything historically that you can kind of draw upon that can kind of help us get us through this point, or where they can find some kind of resolution, some peaceful resolution at this point?
There are two ways this crisis can be resolved, either by a massive crackdown or by serious concessions from the authorities. Mr. Yanukovych so far has alternated between, on the one hand, offering half concessions, or on the other, trying to crack down but being unable to do so. Tonight he is threatening to crack down again, but the opposition and the protesters are staying in the streets, so it's unclear if he will be able to do this. The real way to resolve this... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I wanted to ask you, Ambassador Herbst, is who do you fault more at this point, the president of the Ukraine or the opposition leader?
This crisis is a direct result of the increasing repression in Ukraine under President Yanukovych over the past several years. There would not be thousands and tens of thousands in the streets today if he had not tried to crack down on a demonstration which was originally against just European integration. But his regular use of repressive tactics is what put people into the streets. So this is really a crisis that he has created.
Now, Russia is also playing a role here and has been backing the president at this point, also shoring up their bonds, their country bonds. Russia, in terms of their role, what should it be, in your view?
Well, unfortunately, Mr. Putin is an authoritarian, and he would hate to see a real step towards democracy in Ukraine. So he is encouraging Mr. Yanukovych to crack down on the demonstrators. There can be a peaceful resolution to this, a resolution consistent with Ukrainian political values, if Mr. Yanukovych were to agree to a constitutional change which would make the prime minister independent of the president, and then offer that position to the opposition.
Ambassador Herbst, you were there during a period in Kiev that is known as the Orange Revolution, and you were involved in a lot of events, if you read any kind of reports, that really led up to and defined President Yushchenko's presidency. What can we learn about that period and what we saw there and apply it to what we're doing or going through today?
Well, that's a good question, because, in fact, there was a serious protest when I was ambassador in Kiev. And that protest was ultimately led to a political compromise, which led to President Yushchenko, Mr. Yushchenko, becoming the president of Ukraine. But it also involved constitutional change, so that the people giving up authority knew that Mr. Yushchenko would not be all-powerful. That was a solution that worked in 2004. It's a solution that could work in 2014.
So you anticipate
Mr. Yanukovych has to be willing to compromise.
So you anticipate that constitutional change will have to be a part of any kind of resolution at this point?
Well, there are other possibilities. Mr. Yanukovych can step down and permit early elections to the presidency. Those elections are scheduled for 2015, but they could happen this year. But if he wants to retain the presidency, let him agree to give up some of his powers, give the opposition real authority, and then the protesters will clear out.
We addressed a little bit about the role of Russia in all of this. What about the European Union, Mr. Ambassador, as a whole in this region? What should be their role in your view? And are sanctions necessary at this point?
Well, the European Union is the great model for Ukraine to follow. And again, this crisis began when Yanukovych walked away from a trade agreement with the European Union. The European Union has more influence in Ukraine than the United States, because it has the ability to offer incentives that we do not. Ukraine would very much like first this trade agreement with the EU and then eventually become a member. Those are not advantages that the United States can offer. So the EU has an important role to play. As for sanctions, I believe that if there were sanctions on corrupt officials in Ukraine visiting the United States and visiting the European Union, and if there were financial sanctions against the assets of Ukrainian officials in the EU and the United States, this would encourage the Ukrainian government to make the political compromises necessary to a peaceful resolution to this crisis.
You know, you mentioned the United States. I mean, what is particularly their role here?
Well, the United States shares the same interest as the EU in seeing the evolution of a democratic Ukraine. We do have influence as the world's leading power, but we do not have the ability to offer Ukraine incentives that the EU has. So our role is important, but not as important as the EU's. And for that matter, Russia's role is important. But this is a crisis that's created within Ukraine, and it's a crisis that will be resolved by Ukrainians. Outside actors, including Russia and the EU, have relatively limited influence.
Well, Ambassador Herbst, as somebody who was kind of an outside actor, what would be your first step right now in trying to bring some resolution to a situation that is escalating, the death toll is mounting? What would be your first step here?
I would tell the protesters to stop any violent acts whatsoever, stop throwing Molotov cocktails, stop throwing stones. I would tell the government to take all ammunition out of the hands of the Berkut and the police. There have been deaths of protesters, and those have been deaths using real bullets, not rubber bullets. Stop the violence right now. Mr. Yanukovych had invited Mr. Klitschko and Mr. Yatsenyuk, the leaders of the opposition, to talks tomorrow. Let those talks take place. Let Mr. Yanukovych put real concessions on the table. That's the path to a peaceful resolution.
What is your fear? This is 3 months and counting already. As I mentioned, the death toll is mounting. We're seeing further escalation. What is your fear in terms of what may still be yet to come?
Well, it's clear that the situation has already includes violence which has not been part of Ukraine's history for the past 20 or so years. And there are hotheads on both sides who might be interested in seeing increased violence. That's the real danger. But I believe there are also people of sanity in the government and in the opposition, and they can reach an agreement. But the core to that agreement, the key to it, has to be a serious concession by Mr. Yanukovych, which he's not yet been willing to do.